Excellent. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all y'all's help, and we're so grateful to have all of you here with us this afternoon or morning or evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Joshua Lunde-Whitler, and I'm part of the ALLLM board, and would like to welcome you all here. We're so grateful to have HyeRan Kim-Cragg, Jin Kim, and Melissa Wiginton, who's having a few technical issues, but I think we're working on them, and will be back with us shortly. Erica, do you know how she's doing? Are things going okay there?
I don't, but I assume she will be back on one way or another pretty soon.
Excellent. Well, Erica, Eric, it's Knisely, right?
Knisely, okay.
I always get it. Sometimes want to say Knisely, and I know better. So Erica is also on our board, and I've invited Erica to share some opening words of meditation with us as we begin, just to kind of put us in a place of reflection and of reminding ourselves that we are connected with each other even though we are apart. So, Erica, if you will.
Thank you, Josh. It is my pleasure to be here with you all on behalf of the ALLLM board. And I want to begin by lighting a candle to set apart this as a holy conversation, a conversation in which we are seeking flourishing throughout the whole life of ministry and theological education, religious education. And you may hear some banging in the background. I want you to imagine that as a drum. This just happened to be the moment when our handyman stopped by to put some things on the wall. But that's life, and that is our current reality. So take a moment wherever you are and ground yourself on the floor. That might mean pushing the soles of your feet in, getting seated on your chair firmly. Wherever you are, just take a moment to feel your connection to the earth. To take a few deep and cleansing breaths and arrive at this place. We are all in different places, and we want to acknowledge that the different places we are in bring stories with them and histories. I am in Pflugerville, Texas. This was originally the home of the Kwahutecan, indigenous people, Tonkawa, Comanche. Many different peoples have lived in this place. I want to invite you, if you are aware of the people who originated in your place, to put that in the comments as a way of acknowledging the history and the context in which all of us live. So if you'd like to chat that in, please do. And as you're doing that, keep breathing in slow, gentle breaths. Let your shoulders sink back down away from your ears. Let the tension drop. Prepare your hearts and minds to enter this conversation. And as our president and ALLLM has already noted in our chat, we want to lift up Rick Rouse to you all today. Many of you know Rick. Rick has been a long-time member of ALLLM. Before that, it was SACM, and he's serving on our board now. He would definitely be part of this conversation, but he and his family experienced the tragic loss of his son-in-law over the weekend. So we hold them deeply in our hearts and our minds and our prayers, and know that all of us are bringing those kinds of experiences with us today. We are whole people seeking wholeness. And I invite us, as we enter into this conversation, in the words of Parker Palmer, to listen to each other as we would listen to sacred scripture, open, attentive, and mindful of the holy. Let us begin.
Thank you so much, Erica. We really appreciate that. And if you would like to, at any point, acknowledge any of our speakers, just to offer a word of gratitude, and you can do that through the little clap emoji. You can click on that if you would like to offer a round of applause or just an acknowledgement. There's also the laughter button as well, which might be appropriate at times, as well as I guess it's the idea button, which if somebody says something maybe that strikes you as profound and interesting, and you might let somebody know by pressing that button. Just to quickly introduce you all to ALLLM, the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, which is the organization that is a related learning organization with the REA. And so we began this relationship a few years ago and are now into, I guess, our third year of the related learning relationship. And we have a number of people that are in both, but ALLLM's focus has been specifically on what we traditionally call continuous or continuing education. And we have begun to expand our notions of what that actually means. We have ideas of what that is, but it is not only something that happens in theological institutions, as many of us have been a part of and know, but there's a broader view of what theological education can be that's inherent into the notion of continuing education. And that dovetails nicely into where theological education is as a whole right now. There's a lot of conversation happening about we're kind of at a point of transition, so to speak, or some of us may or may not agree with that idea. Theological education right now, in the North American context at least, it seems to be in this point of change, transition. There seems to be a lot of conversation going along with that, with the ATS, as well as when we see various studies being done and different seminaries responding to the rapidly changing needs of the clientele, of students, participants, and some that are thinking even more broadly than that, as maybe there is something that needs to change wholesale. So I feel like there's this agreement, or at least this consensus, that we're in a kind of transition, and we thought it would be really helpful to bring people together from a variety of different locations within this ecosystem that may or may not often get the opportunity to speak to each other, to bring them together, to share and to learn, and to maybe together imagine something that could be different, something that could, where we could be going. So I'd like you all to imagine this as an imaginative exercise, because we need that power of the prophetic imagination in our teaching as well as in our theology. And we need this idea of, we need to be able to imagine things so that we can then begin to explore and to try and do new things. So I would invite you all to imagine this. This is an imaginative exercise together, even though we are rooted in a particular context and in the locations in which we find ourselves. And maybe at the end of this, we can come to some new thoughts, come to some insights that may take us in new directions that we hadn't thought possible. So what I'd like us to do is I'd like to introduce our speakers very briefly here to start, and then introduce the topic, and we're going to allow everybody an opportunity to speak, and have about 7 to 10 minutes per panelist. And after that point, we're going to take questions. I think I have a few questions. Maybe some of the other ALLLM members may have some questions prepared, but we'll then open it up widely to the floor. And so I encourage you all, you can start this process now, is if you would like to start thinking about the questions that you would like to ask about what it means to educate the whole person and the whole life of ministry. Start thinking about what your questions might be, and as you come up with those, you can make note of that. And then when we get to the point where we start asking for questions, you can request the mic, which is the microphone button at the bottom of your screen. And when you press that, you'll show up in a queue where we will be able to select you in order based on when you request the mic. And we invite you up onto the stage and you can share your question. You can also type comments if you would rather do it that way. But we'd like to encourage you all and challenge you all, if you're able to do so. I understand it's not possible for everybody, but if it's possible, to come on screen and to share your face with us so that it's a little more personal that way. But however you want to share your question, we would like to open this up as a broader dialogue. So without further ado, I would like to introduce, no particular order here, we have HyeRan Kim-Cragg is the graduate degree director and associate professor of preaching at Emmanuel College in Toronto. She's the author of many books and articles, including Post-Colonial Preaching, which is in process. I believe it's come out or is about to come out. You can correct me on that, HyeRan. And then she also wrote Interdependence, which is a post-colonial feminist practical theology. And she's been a member of the REA as well as the International Association of Practical Theology and a number of other places. Jin Kim is the founding pastor of the Church of All Nations in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and is the chief cultural architect of the Underground Seminary, which the website describes as an alternative theological program, also based in Minneapolis. And Melissa Wiginton is our third panelist, and she is the vice president of Education Beyond the Walls, which is as part of Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary's lifelong learning program. She's designer of a number of programs, including the fellowships in pastoral leadership for public life, the leader of the Houses of Hope, which is a small town church initiative, and a co-creator of the 787 Collective. So we have representatives from a higher education doing theological education. We have the alternative theological program, and we have a continuing educator as well. And so I would like to invite you all to welcome all three of our panelists. And Melissa has been having a little bit of technical issues, but I think we will hopefully be able to see her shortly. There we are. And if your camera is still not working, Melissa, then at least we still have your voice, which is wonderful, and we will look forward to listening to it. So join me in welcoming all three of our panelists, and without further ado, I'd like to allow HyeRan to take the floor and to share with us what you have prepared.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's a real delight and privilege to see so many wonderful colleagues and students here, and an honor to be invited by ALLLM to share my humble thoughts and insights on cultivating the whole person throughout the whole lifespan of ministry. The topic that ALLLM chose to explore this year is very timely in my context, Canada, where the whole country has been reckoning with the revelation of the unmarked graves of 215 children near a residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia last month. Another burial site with the remains of as many as 751 people, mainly children, and a few others was found in Saskatchewan, not far from where I lived before I moved back to Toronto 2 years ago. Last week, there was another discovery of just under 200 unmarked graves at another residential school in BC. The existence of these graves, which had been raised during the Truth and Reconciliation process 5 years ago, was forcefully revealed. The wounds that are never fully healed were exposed and reopened. Residential school survivors and their children, their grandchildren are re-traumatized. The rest of us in Canada feel haunted by the colonial legacy. And it begs a question. What does it mean to be whole in this context? So when I wrote Interdependence, year 2018, I had a kind of wholeness of individuals and communities in mind. And that's why the book is like a circle. Begins with examining the self, each one of us seeking holistic personhood as the first circle, followed by other circles, family, church, or other religious communities, nation, and the very planet Earth, the biggest circle within which all living beings find themselves. And each chapter is in a way envisioned as a circle layer upon other circle, noting that the one circle without the other circles cannot become whole. I'm sharing this because when we discuss wholeness as a lens through which to view the present and future practices, pedagogies, and processes of theological education, we need to keep in mind that these various circles of relationships and organizations are essential parts that contribute to cultivating wholeness for oneself and the whole world in interdependent ways. In a way, the cultivation of the whole person throughout their lifespan can never be achieved in an individualistic way or thought of it in a short time span, in any linear way. Intergenerational communal work across generations from this life to the next life must be the frame through which we look when we think of doing theological education. That includes doing religious education and doing lifelong ministry. So these days, with the pandemic and everything else going on, I especially feel my heart is aching. And to the point of the heart of the matter, in a way, is to recognize that there is suffering and that we all seek healing. So in some ways, my proposal to you today is that addressing suffering toward healing is actually one of the most important goals of theological education. Seeking holistic theological education is to kind of cultivate hearts that can feel and heal the pain. And our very own physical body really reminds us of this lesson, that the heart is in the middle, connecting the head to the rest of the body, the theory to the practice. It is integration of theory and practice centered on the heart, that is, on the experience of suffering and the response to that suffering, should be one of the most pivotal aims of theological education for cultivating wholeness. So I teach at Emmanuel College in the University of Toronto. Emmanuel College is doing theological education in two distinctive and new ways that are worth noting for this topic that we are discussing today. First, it strives to become an inter-religious school where not only Christians, but also Buddhists, Muslims, Jews, and others come and study. Our school is doing, I would say, heart-centered theological education, addressing issues of suffering that are shared between different faith groups. Cultivating these inter-religious competencies and sensitivities is a strength, something that I believe all Christian theological schools may benefit from. The second unique way that Emmanuel is doing theological education these days is the focused study of mental illness of students, clergy, and other religious leaders. In order to cultivate wholeness as a goal of theological education, we know that we must attend to mental illness. And this is particularly critical when people with mental illness are stigmatized and further marginalized. So let me speak further on this heart-centered theological education as a post-colonial feminist practical theologian. Among other theologies, practical theology highlights that there is an importance attention to the brokenness arising from the situated and embodied character of human life. That's why practical theology underscores the importance of the lived experiences and habitual practices. And these experiential practices harness the power of sensory embodiment. holistic theological education that cultivates the wholeness of the person and their communities affirms lived realities and is sensitive to the ways when we express ourselves and also carry psychological and spiritual wounds in embodied ways. Doing theological education toward wholeness, therefore, must and can touch our hearts if we are to move and change. And this heart-centered approach to theological education grants us a more contextually astute witness to abstract issues such as long-endured brutal colonial violence, global migration, neoliberal transnational capitalism, and many corrupted political and religious systems. So work of doing holistic theological education is not only about addressing abstract issues that are critical, but also grappling with the forms of oppression that we carry in our bodies and experience as part of our religious communal life. That is really something that I feel very strongly due to my own context in Canada, right? That story, the unmarked burial site of more than 1,000 children and others in residential schools bring the past, those wounds and the violence into the present in a very powerful way. And I believe we need to cultivate the hearts to hear those untold stories, to change the system in order to heal the wounds and live together. And we need to have hearts of courage to confront these ugly faces of colonial violence. But being whole or seeking wholeness is not same as being perfect, right? And here I am speaking as a Reformed Christian, that we are sinful and we are and will never be perfect. And that's why we are in need of redemption, always reforming, always growing and changing. To end my short reflection here, let me offer a wholeness, that very word in East Asian ideograms, which is onjan. And Josh, if you can share that screen of this word, I will appreciate it. The first character on in onjan is made of two very important characters, and that is one is rice and the other is heart. What this Eastern Asian linguistic wisdom on being whole teaches that we cannot seek wholeness without the basic needs, food and feelings. Theological education towards wholeness includes feeding one another and meeting the needs of the heart, which is sometimes bleeding to suffering and sometimes pounding with joy and changing after repentance. So I'm really looking forward to our conversations and with our colleagues, panelists. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Everybody can share their applause and beginning their comments there. And anytime you hear something or want to reflect, we encourage you to go ahead and do so in the comments. Next, I'd like to invite Jin, if you're available, to come on up and to grab the mic, so to speak, and the camera. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. And thank you, HyeRan, for that wonderful presentation. We're doing some new things here in theological education, but just a little background. In 2004, after 10 and a half years as an associate pastor in the Korean immigrant church context, some of us launched Church of All Nations here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And the reason we launched this church was that we believe that the church, while it would address sin in general, the institutional church did not seem to be taking sin in its particular and pernicious form in this country, the sin of racism, seriously. It is the founding sin of the American Republic and Empire, after all. So we wondered what it would be like to start a church that addressed the sin of racism at its very foundation, and that if Jesus is truly the Savior, Jesus must start with the most damning sin of all in all our common life together here in American Empire. As we continue to journey in this way, we had a very robust internship program, and we took seminary graduates from many of the major mainline and even evangelical seminaries across the country. So I myself am a PCUSA pastor, third generation Presbyterian. And so we often drew students from graduates of Presbyterian seminaries. But the work of forming these graduates was quite challenging because we had to unform their notions about what pastor ministry was. I mean, a lot of it was just making a living, having a job, and getting a pension. And not that there's anything wrong with those things, but whatever understanding of vocation they may have going into it, so much of it was scrubbed off because of the assumptions of the professional ministry, of the collar and the robe and the stole and all of the trappings of the ministerial life in mainstream institutional Christian religion. So then I began to wonder what it would be like to form them before they started seminary by creating a seminary where the fundamental goal was to have people, to equip people to actually follow Jesus in the way that Jesus led 2,000 years ago. And that required a radical rethinking of pedagogy itself, how we learn, and not just what we learn. But just for efficiency's sake, I'll just read from our website a little bit. Our underground is undergroundsem.org. We founded the seminary in 2014. And so this is our 8th year this fall. And we actually have a full cohort this fall. 12 students is the max that we've designed the seminary for. But this is how we describe Underground Seminary. Christian leadership requires radical revisioning in the 21st century. The patriarchal, white, Western, capitalist framework that has dominated the globe the last few hundred years has failed to deliver on its promise of greater prosperity and well-being. As people on the margins have always known, the ideology of empire is perverse and demonic in its far-reaching effects. Whiteness, the ideology of the American empire, was birthed in conquest and theft and has led to a global neoliberal system where everything is a commodity to be devoured for profit. The earth cries out on the brink of ecosystemic collapse. This is an age for prophets and healers. As indigenous peoples have long recognized, the need is not for more progress, but remembering and returning to the kinship that has been lost. Once the layers of imperial co-optation are peeled away, the indigenous and ancestral presence in the Bible is liberated to guide us on this journey of decolonization. Through Underground Seminary, the Biblical Witness, and through Underground Seminary, students develop the ability to read history, the Bible, and their own story through a post-colonial lens. We excavate the past and face the historical betrayals of communion with God's good creation, while also uncovering the rich ancestral wisdom that lies beneath. Our pedagogy for this journey of decolonization is classroom seminars in a small cohort of peers, participation in community housing right around the church, daily meals together, projects and trips that integrate the learning, one-on-one mentoring and counseling, and occasional work projects. Our alternative theological program aims to heal students' connection to their roots, liberate the spirit, and restore an experience of kinship with the whole of creation so that together we can follow Jesus in his ministry as a prophet and healer. That's our basic description. We launched the seminary in the age of Obama, in Obama's second term. And people wondered, why is there a need for underground seminary? And our name is drawn from and inspired by Dietrich Bonhoeffer's underground seminary during the time of the Nazi reign in Germany. And he had to create literally a secret underground seminary because the confessing church was illegal and was persecuted by Hitler. They did the seminary for about 18 months before it was discovered and shut down, and later Bonhoeffer imprisoned and executed by Hitler's direct order right before the end of the World War II. And so we had a sense that we were living in a time of rising fascism in our own country, and that we had to prepare leaders to resist fascism, as well as the ongoing neoliberal system and American empire in general, which gives birth to all of these evils. And then 2 years later, Donald Trump is elected president, and we have the events in Charlottesville and all kinds of, it's an environment conducive to all kinds of fascists, racists, white supremacists coming out of the woodwork until we have the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th this year. And so I believe that the creation of Underground Seminary was very timely. And for us to be a healing force and a prophetic voice in our society that actually equips people for ministry in a time of rising fascism is just part and parcel of who we are and our founding. And I myself have been educated in mainline seminaries, and I'm grateful for that. I learned a lot, and it was actually a rich experience for me. I have a Master of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry in Presbyterian seminaries here in the United States. And I believe that just having a few progressive classes is not enough when the institution of our modern day seminaries, Bible colleges, and other Christian educational institutions are fundamentally funded by white money and led by white power. The seminary that I graduated from had a whole bunch of money invested in Wall Street, to the point that something like 73 or 78% of the annual operating budget came from interest earned from Wall Street. Even if it's a relatively liberal and progressive school, what kind of critique of our overall imperial system are we going to make when the entire school, our scholarships, the professor salaries, the administration, the buildings, the grounds, and everything is funded directly by Wall Street? So it was very important for us to create a seminary that was not funded by white power or white money at all, so that we had true freedom to critique the systems and create a new way of life. Our seminary primarily functions it functions as primarily a school for our students to equip them for prophetic and healing ministry, but also it has become a think tank for Church of All Nations. And we do wildly creative and imaginative theological work here, as well as implementing it through the church that we have. We have many community houses right around the church. Probably at least a quarter, now approaching a third of our congregation, are now living in intentional Christian community houses that are directly operated by the church. We've launched 5 church-based businesses, and we're launching more. One of our tongue-in-cheek mottos is, how do we exploit capitalism before it exploits us, for village renewal's sake? And of course, we've started this seminary that is deeply rooted in the life and ministry and vibrancy and innovation of Church of All Nations itself. And then we do very deep therapeutic somatic work with our members, both with therapists, outstanding somatic therapists in our area, as well as somatic therapy that we do within the congregation in concert together. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. There's many other things I could mention, but I'll just stop here and discuss more during our Q&A time. Thank you for this opportunity.
All right, everybody can join me in Sing up your virtual applause to Jin. Thank you so much for that. Really inspiring stuff. Thank you. Melissa, I know that you're coming in on a phone here. I think it will work okay. We see you there. So if we don't get your camera, that's okay. We can listen to your voice. And again, we're so sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're glad to have you here. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Okay, so you cannot see me.
Correct.
I would have to go out of the room and come back in. Well, maybe I'll do that after my remarks.
Okay.
And I'm so bummed not to be able to be seen because I know how boring that is. But that's okay. I am not here just to be seen, but I do so appreciate the invitation to be part of this conversation today. I'm really honored to be on the panel with Pastor Kim and Dr. Kim-Cragg, who are doing such amazing work. And I'm grateful to Josh and to Erica Knisely and all the people at ALLLM that put this panel together. Education Beyond the Walls is part of theological education offered through Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and that is where I do my work. Austin Seminary was established in 1902 as a school to educate Presbyterian pastors on the frontier, and it remains in covenant relationship with the PCUSA. The seminary has survived many social, cultural, economic, and geopolitical changes in the past 120 years. Among those changes to our context is that Texas is no longer considered the geographic edge of the United States. It's not the frontier geographically. Some people feel like it's still kind of the Wild West politically and are delighted about that, and others agree with them and are horrified by it. So that's Texas. That's our home. And that's where I am today. In the first decade of the 21st century, the seminaries responded to continually changing conditions with 4 new structures for theological education in addition to the MDiv and the MA and the DMin. They are the Certificate in Ministry, a hybrid program for lay pastors, Certificado en Ministerio, an online program for lay pastors taught in Spanish with attention to Latinx culture from that Latinx cultural perspectives, a Certificate in Jewish-Christian Relationships, and a Master of Arts in Youth Ministry, which is remarkable because it is offered in partnership with the Center for Youth Ministry Training, which is not a seminary. Our academic dean oversees these certificate programs and the new master's degree. Our faculty teach in these programs, and they have made changes in their pedagogies, their syllabi, and certainly their use of technology to provide all of these learners with quality education. And then there is us, the Department of Education Beyond the Walls, outside the jurisdiction of the academic dean, designed to serve learners outside degree programs. You might say we are the Skunk Works. Skunk Works is a term some of you may know. It's used in the business world to talk about a small team taken out of the normal working environment and given exceptional freedom from their organization's standard management constraints. They are a relatively small and loosely structured group of people who research and develop a project primarily for the sake of radical innovation. The skunk works of an organization invests time, energy, and resources towards something that does not already exist, toward creating something new that is not or not yet part of the core work of the organization, and it may not ever be. So, with some qualifiers on how much freedom we actually have from institutional constraints, and how radical our innovations actually are, we are the skunk works. We are a part, but apart. And our job is not to change the institution's core. Our job is theological education of a different sort. We self-consciously describe our work as creating transformative theological learning experiences for ministers, teachers, healers, and communities to nourish mind, heart, and spirit. Yes, I think that is way too broad to be a great mission statement, but it honestly captures what we are trying to do, which is to create transformative theological learning experiences for ministers, teachers, healers, and communities to nourish mind, heart, and spirit. And I hope you hear our stake in wholeness in those words. Willie James Jennings helps me bring to consciousness the deep shift that I think we could be making. We're not there, but I hope we are in process. In his book, After Whiteness, Dr. Jennings argues that theological educational institutions who were formed in the mindset of colonialism, in the mindset of whiteness, or as my friend Bill Lamar would say, living in the principality of whiteness, they understand themselves to be the destination. That is the place where knowledge is located, where you can go and get knowledge from the people who have the knowledge. Now, that's a truncated description of his very sophisticated analysis, but it's really got me curious, and it's got me paying attention in a different way to what we are doing. Dr. Jennings contrasts this destination with journey. Journeys with others out from where we are. Yes?
Melissa?
Hello?
Can you hear us okay, Melissa?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. It sounds like a few folks from the chat were having a little bit of trouble hearing. Is that still the case, Erica?
Yes.
Okay, because I can actually hear her okay.
Okay. So I just wanted to check in for everyone else.
Yeah, there were others that were having some issues, but we can, Eric, I don't know if you have an idea there, Eric, but we can...
Melissa, your phone, you're on a phone, your bandwidth on the phone is low, and so every now and then your video is coming in and out. We can see you in glimpses, so just know that every now and then we see you sideways or we see your ceiling. And we do hear you for the most part, but if the bandwidth is particularly low, we may not hear you very well. But I would just continue.
You might be able to turn off, if your camera is on, you might turn that off and that might help. Oh no. There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Of course.
If I might have a little more time. So what we are trying to do is create transformative theological learning experiences for ministers, teachers, healers, and communities to nourish mind, heart, and spirit. And I hope you hear our stake and wholeness in those words. Willie James Jennings helps me bring to consciousness the deep shift that I think we could be making. We are not there, but I hope we are in process. In his book, After Whiteness, Dr. Jennings argues that theological institutions founded by the Western colonial mindset, or as my friend Bill Lamar says, institutions living in the principality of whiteness, understand themselves as the destination. That is the place where knowledge is located, where you come and get the knowledge from those who have it. This is a truncated description of his analysis, but I've become curious about this and began to pay attention in a different way to what we were doing. Dr. Jennings contrasts destination with journey, journeys with others out from where we are to a new land of knowing. I've started to wonder if our work in Education Beyond the Walls might be shifting away from being a destination and shifting toward mapping and resourcing journeys. A shift from one route of education, educare, which means to train or form, to the other route of education, educere, which means to lead out. From our place in theological education, we are trying to open space for what is emerging. We are part of the institution's mission and supported with a budget and infrastructure. Yet holding open space for what is emerging makes some people very uncomfortable because we are outside of the norms of classrooms, credits, semesters, matriculation, accreditation, and scholarly guilds. This location gives us a great responsibility to be faithful stewards of our resources and to be reflective, responsive practitioners. So I want to name for you some of the core commitments that we hold as we live into what is emerging, the contours that shape our journey as theological educators. First, put people and not only pastors at the center. Second, and these aren't in order of priority, but first is really put people first, put people at the center. Second is build relationships and go beyond individuals and beyond what is comfortable. Third, privilege creativity and imagination. This is an area that needs to be strengthened, I think, especially among clergy who are run dry by the demands of contexts with too much challenge. Take risks, trust the process, and then go again. And the final one, do what we are called to do because of who and where we are and the gifts we have been given. Remember that everyone doesn't have to do everything. Follow the joy, the opportunity, and the opening of a way. I have stories to share about each of these contours, but I will stop here and maybe we'll talk more specifically if there are questions. Throughout these remarks, I have used we, because I do not do this alone. I work with remarkable people, and we try to live this journey ourselves. I'm grateful to be part of this work and to be part of theological education.
Well, a big round of applause and note of gratitude to Melissa for putting up with all the technological difficulties. Thank you so much. I know that was a headache, but we really appreciated your words and your insights from all the amazing work that you all are doing in Austin. And now I'd like to invite all three of our panelists back up to the stage. You all can click on the video camera and on the audio. There we are. And Erica, you're welcome to pop in and out, or you can stay hidden if you want for the moment, or you can pop in and out if you want. I just wanted to get the ball rolling as we're talking about wholeness and the whole life of ministry, because we heard three very different contexts, but there were a lot of themes that ties the work that you all are doing together. Namely, if we're thinking about what the future of theological education looks like, thinking about resourcing journeys, as Melissa talked about, equipping disciples and religious leaders to resist hegemony, to putting people, in various ways, talking about putting people or learners at the center, and putting communities and thinking about communities first above individuals. And also this idea about honoring bodies and contexts of people who we come into contact with. And that, I think, fits very that connects us very closely to the themes and some of the other conversations that we've been having at the RAA conference so far, is as we're talking about educating for gender and sexuality and thinking about wholeness, we're also thinking about embodied people. The issues of race and gender and sexuality as these dividing lines that we create, as these ways in which we create these names and labels that we use in order to promote, to either put people in boxes or to create opportunities to shame people. And we are looking towards this idea of community. And I'm just curious what you all have to say, or what would you like to say a little bit more about how do we continue to honor bodies in all their diversity? How do we continue to, as we were talking about with, I think it was HyeRan was talking about embodied learning, which includes this idea of honoring each other in all of our diversity, including our sexuality and our gender and our race and various ways in which we identify ourselves as bodies in the world. Because theological education in general, when we think about wholeness, that part kind of seems to be missing sometimes. And I think you all have alluded to that in various ways. So I'd like to just open the floor if you have anything to share, to say more about this, and so to connect us a little bit with some of the other talks that we've been talking about these past few days.
I love to hear others on the comments, but talking about embodiment or embodied learning, recognizing our own bodies, that bodies are holistic, right? So not just the physical, but it's the emotional, spiritual, and mental as well. I'm so inspired by my students who are not Christians, whose religious practices seem to involve those bodies way more explicitly than some of us who are trained to be Reformed Christians and very distant and ordered and, emotionally kind of detached. So one way to, I think, put outside of the box is to be vulnerable, I think, to be taking risks, because showing our own bodies and engaging that experiences are brave, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing that I talked about heart is that, I don't know about you, during last 1.5 years of Zoom teaching or asynchronous meetings and learning, we almost disembodied, right? We kind of forget about our own bodies and then suffer from it. And so even if Zoom meeting, several sessions that I've been in this, I was so grateful for this time to really ground and intentional time to listen to our heartbeat as much as intentionally breathing in and out. And that's not a kind of joke or kind of checkpoint. I think it should be really a daily habitual practices that we all need, and more so because of this, COVID-19 pandemic situation. So something that I think we need to keep continuing it. So, and then finally about sharing, right? I mean, everyone talking about combating the individualistic notion of self, individual, privatized kind of lifestyle, right? That we have to rediscover our ancestors in faith of the communal way of life. And the sharing, the very notion of sharing is cut open. The sharing is about cutting our own bread to share. And that sense of kind of sacrifice, that sense of, but also kind of cutting our heart open toward others. So physically, but also materially, right? Food has to be shared. Our resources has to be shared. Our gifts has to be shared. But that takes our heart to yearn and heart to ache and heart to connect, right? And so that's what I was trying to say. But yeah, I'm sure other folks have other things to share too. Thank you.
I'd like to, I don't know how I can raise my hand if you can't see me. Can you hear me? I was thinking about what you said, HyeRan, about the beating and the pounding of the heart. And I think that's language that I'll bring into our grounding times when we are doing some teaching, because I love that image of both the beating, you said beating and suffering and pounding and joy, something like that. Yeah. So that listening to the heartbeat is a similar, breathing or practices that we do. I find for myself, I'm having to overcome the notion that every minute must be filled with content or it doesn't count, and that somehow people are not going to think they're not getting their money's worth if they get a long break. And I guess that's, a lot about my, and I had a colleague who used to say, you better fill that time, Melissa, because if you don't, they'll turn on you. And so I have those messages that I have to unlearn as somebody who's trying to set a space for wholeness. And the last thing I'll say is we do try to attend to this in a lot of different ways. And one of the things that we did was commission a special cookie recipe for Education Beyond the Walls cookies that are, quote, healthy. They have quinoa in them. But anyway, it's a fun thing to remind people to, you can be healthy and enjoy feeding yourself. So it's a playful thing, but I think that playfulness is really a part of wholeness as well. And it makes people uncomfortable sometimes, but they'll come around.
I heartily endorse my colleagues' statements and am enriched by them. I'll just add that I learned a lot by reading the Barmen Declaration during the time of the Confessing Church, as well as the Bellar Confession against South African apartheid. What's powerful about those documents is not just what it says yes to, but what it says no to. The yes has power because it names the no. In that dialectic, we owe something to Peter Abelard, an early scholastic theologian, in his Sic et Non. And so one of the things that I think is critically important to do in theological education is say the no clearly. What is it that we're saying no to? And the reason why I think we're rightly focusing on the body is because of Western civilization obsession with abstraction. It is abstraction made into philosophy is a type of mental illness. My experience as a pastor for 30 years, and I very much resonate with Professor Kim-Cragg's assessment on this, is that whiteness is a sociological mental illness. It is something that Professor Jack Forbes, an indigenous scholar, has called Wetiko in his language, or we have Ojibwe people around here, and they call it Wendigo, but it means cannibal disease. And it's this kind of whiteness is a type of cancerous behavior where people devour everything in sight, even if it destroys their own habitat and therefore themselves. Western civilization is like a cancer that knows growth, that does not know any limits to growth until it devours the planet. And then it is able to then not take this seriously or not confront it because of its flight to abstraction. So it's because of the flight to abstraction that is endemic in Western civilization that people are trained from kindergarten on to sit on their butts all day long, thinking that their minds can just be a repository of information that can be recalled at any time in adulthood. But it's really training for 13 years straight to have people do repetitive motion in factories or sit in a cubicle for 40 years. It's a training. The pedagogy itself is training for a rapacious, exploitative, a wage slavery, and debt slavery capitalism. So what are we doing in our theological institutions if we're repeating the pedagogy of capitalism and the flight to abstraction, which is how we get people to not be aware that they are in a slave system so that they can just be cogs in a neoliberal machine.
That was very powerful. Thank you all. And there's whiteness and there's colonialism and capitalism, and that was when we were talking about last week when we all got together and shared a little bit. We definitely got into the capitalist side of things, of how those structures, we live within them, and we want to critique them as well as model other opportunities. And you all are doing various, in your own context, are finding ways to do that, which I find to be very inspiring and also important as we're thinking about what will theological education look like in the coming decades? What should it look like, rather, right? And how might we, in our context, help move us in that direction? Would maybe just if anybody has any ideas on where do you see things going? Where would you like to see things going? You already touched a little bit on that just now, Jin, when you were talking about, or we're just kind of sitting everybody in rows and training people to sit still. What if theological education looked a little bit different? And of course, we've got a number of folks in the Religious Education Association who are working on that exact idea and working on embodied learning. What do you see, if you could imagine what the future would look like, and how would we educate for wholeness better? What could we begin to do? And some of you all are already doing that in your own settings and beginning to work towards that. But I wonder if you would like to say a little bit about that. And while you're formulating answers and responding, I invite others to begin to start thinking about your questions and to be ready to grab the mic.
Well, I'll just respond quickly here that the institutional church reminds me of the story of the emperor has no clothes. I mean, when I was on the CPM, that's a Committee on Preparation for Ministry. It's a group of pastors and elders who get together at the presbytery level to screen candidates for pastoral ministry or ordained ministry. And basically, our job was to protect the reputation and the elitism of Presbyterian ordination. So, we're screening people to meet elitist standards. And this was our job, our role, our volunteer labor. And what elitism, what respect, what authority does the modern institutional church have? So the whole ordination system to screen people out so that the elitist reputation of the ministerium is preserved is a ridiculous notion, and nobody buys it anymore. So this is why Underground Seminary has not sought accreditation, because accredited for what and by whom? An existing white supremacist system run by people who are captive to whiteness and American imperialism. That's ridiculous. The people that come to our seminary are people who want to learn how to do village renewal in the way that Jesus did, against very clearly and specifically contra the imperial power of the day, American empire today. So we have to name what we're up against and then form people for what people really want to do, which is genuine community building, embodiment, as we talked about, and people coming together to do an alternative way of life against the forces of death that the modern day American empire represents. And I think whole new institutions have to be created if we're going to do that. Otherwise, I think some of us may be able to do reform from within. I fully support that. But most of us are going to be tinkering at the edges without any real consequence.
That's great. Really inspiring. Just one thing I want to add to all those in terms of capacity building. I wonder, we need to really learn to imagine. So I was talking about those unmarked grave sites, and those are from at least 100 years to who knows, right? 75 years. And how do we hear their cries? How do we know what they would have been if they weren't dead? We would never know fully, but I wonder that theological education should fund to cultivate capacity to imagine, to hear their voices that are impossible to hear otherwise. And so then I think we need to completely rely on the Spirit and also each other's capacity. So that's one. The other issue, which is also related to anti-capitalism, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism, which is about addressing ecological crisis, which is totally intersectional. And that can we, as human species, be able to hear the heartbeat of our, nature and creation crying out as well. So these are kind of beyond cognitive learning or knowledge, right? We need beyond that capacity. And that's where I was talking about heart. And literally even verbal, right? And again, so how the knowledge is constructed and who collects and who justify this is knowledge and this is not. When we actually need to learn to listen to the birds saying to us and our ancestors calling us to move on or carry. The talk about ancestors, but I'm also hearing of amazing scholars these days, future ancestors. So I am imagining having a classroom with our students preparing for ministry, and that few other chairs that are 2 generations down the road. And our students have to hear our future ancestors talking to us about life and the context and the issues. And so being able to kind of cultivate those, which needs more than just letters or written papers, right? Other things that happen, whether it's art, whether it's learn to wonder and having a intentional time to have a silence, really listen to our bodies and each other's bodies, and those bodies that are not counted before, right? So those are, I think, really exciting but challenging ways to do theological education. But I can see it happening already. So that's a hopeful sign.
I will just say I have no idea what the future of theological education is. I think these suggestions and observations are very, I think they're right on. I think they're salient. I think we are going to make the road by walking, and it will take conversion of lots of people and things, and that way of walking is a way of kenosis and conversion and resurrection. And I will bring the cookies.
Yes, excellent. Please do. And thank you for reminding us of the Paulo Freire quote, which is very helpful to be thinking about. And also, as we're thinking about these issues, we're reminding that many of us are coming from primarily Christian contexts, but this is also as HyeRan has reminded us, that this is how we're thinking about what that road will look like. It will involve walking with others, including our brothers and sisters from other faiths, as well as those of no faith, as we continue to work together. But we all bring ourselves and our own context into that space, and so doing so in a way that is continuing to bring and open doors rather than close them. And you all have spoken to that so well so far. I'd like to open the floor, and we first have Kathy, who is asked to grab the mic, and then we're going to try and get Norma on after that, and we'll see if that works. But Kathy, I'm inviting you on now. There we are.
All right, you can hear me?
Yep.
I've had an experience this year that completely has altered how I teach. And I've been a pretty fair, good teacher, faculty in terms of being creative and trying to embody things. But I spent 3 months in the hospital. And of those 3 months, 8 weeks were in ICU. I had a brain aneurysm in the worst place possible. And they almost lost me 3 times. I had 3 strokes with it. Now, while I admittedly don't remember a lot because my brain could not make memories at that time. However, what I do remember is what I learned from that was, one, I was not in control at all. But I watched how people around me worked, and I had a very diverse group of people at Vassar Hospital from all corners of the world. And all they did all day long, they listen, they share, with each other. They shared their gifts with me in terms of healing. They weren't worried about any particulars that I may have represented or whatever. They didn't care about that. And what they did is they communicated heart to heart. And my chaplain was one of them. I was fortunate to have one of our chaplains that I helped train, and she was there on my side most of the time. And it changed my way of thinking of how relating to people, what embodiment really means, what wholeness means. I definitely would spend more of my time in the classroom now doing a lot more listening, maybe facilitating, and allowing the students to share their gifts and come together for a reason, and that the reason is learning. I mean, one of my definitions of teaching is creating an environment in which learning takes place. And so the men and women at Vassar on my teams taught me what it means to create that environment. And if it hadn't been for that, I'm not sure I would be here, to be honest. Especially New Year's Day was the worst. But I appreciate them because since I've come home, and I've seen that same attitude expressed in people around me who helped me. And that's what I think about now. How can I do that? That's what embodiment means. The medical staff embodied everything that was good. And without that, I wouldn't be here, to be honest. And I recognize that. So then I feel as a result of that, and I talk to the chaplain often, as she is a good friend of mine, she lives near me, about how we can do that better with our students. Wherever I may end up teaching or working, how do we do that better? How do I let go of myself and my image of myself as a teacher, a faculty, or whatever? No, that doesn't matter to me. How do I allow God to just live and breathe through me so that I can embody things and be a model for whoever I'm working with, so that they too can feel free to embody who they are. And then we share it with each other and learn. So that's not that I have something to give them, but rather, how do you release what they have to give us? If you get what I mean. That's why my thinking about teaching is so different. It was a life-changing experience. Not that I recommend it for everyone, but that's what I was thinking.
Thank you so much. That's a very powerful experience. And so thank you for sharing that. If anybody has any comments, I'm inviting Norma on stage and we'll see if she's able to connect. But meanwhile, if anybody had any comments in response to Kathy. Yes, thank you. Yes, leave her comments, Maravir. Norma, okay, so I'm going to read Norma's comments. She mentioned that a number of years ago, as a seminary professor, I knew I needed to go out beyond the abstract, beyond the seminary wall. So referencing Melissa there. Over the years, I visited over 200 congregations where our graduates served and walked around their communities with them. And then all of our faculty did that. We learned from people's context and then shaped pastor diaconal practices from which we transformed and changed seminary curriculum. What would happen if all of our theological education communities did that and actually took the context of where they are already located, doing the work seriously enough to partner with faith communities and actually learn from them? And I think we talked about this a little bit in our pre-session, was the idea that what if seminaries are not just for the people that attend it or just individuals that attend it, but also for the communities in which they are located. And so these are ideas I think are very, when we're thinking about moving past this idea of individualistic empowerment towards this commodified, individualistic, superhuman notion of what a pastor is supposed to be, and thinking about honoring communities and thinking about how do we uplift communities, and that it includes addressing social sin, and it includes partnering with community organizers. It involves a variety of. It involves holism. It involves looking at the human beings as whole beings, and there's just so much here. We'd love to hear more questions if you have any, and panelists, if you see anything in the chat that you'd like to talk about or address, by all means, please feel free to do that. If that triggers any ideas for you, just go for it. Otherwise, friends, if you would like to grab the mic, let me know.
I'll just make one comment, Josh. In my presbytery, the presbytery of the Twin Cities area here in Minnesota, we're losing several congregations per year. My denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, which is one of the three original Protestant denominations in colonial America, is bleeding hundreds of congregations per year. We're at the rate of our decline and our demise, we will not even be a denomination in just a few short decades. And yet, our education institutions have their own internal logic and their own internal finances. So they have every incentive to enroll as many students as possible, keep up the enrollment with all kinds of incentives and whatnot. And of course, professors should get paid, administrators should get paid, and the campus needs to be up and running and all that. But the reality of the pressures to keep the education institution going is not the same as what is happening out in the actual institutional church world. So what we're doing is we're creating a musical chairs scenario where there's all these pastors floating around, plus new graduates, newly ordained people trying to find a position with nowhere to go, and it becomes incredibly competitive and also toxic. So I just feel like the people that need to be in the same room are not, and they're operating either out of their own internal logic and not the well-being of the whole Church of Jesus Christ.
I have, well, really a couple questions, but starting with, this is one conversation, but this is work of reformation and resurrection and deep soul work, as Kathy was really alluding to in her experience. How do you think we can best support each other, even if we're in different contexts, in continuing on this journey together? I'd be curious to hear your ideas on that.
That's a very good question. So I was talking about earlier on the, being whole is not the same as being perfect. But I also think that being kind of complete is also a myth. In that sense of we as educators know, right? Never, learning never ends, and we never learn everything. So why do I say this? Is because, whenever we talk about the kingdom of God or kingdom of God, the reign of God here and now, and some young people say, where is it? Right? We don't see it, or how do we know that we have it? And often we say, I mean, at least I would respond, is that we see the glimpse of it. In other words, we see the partial in a holistic way, but never be complete. In terms of the colonial legacies, I'm so astonished by how often our narrative, our kind of dominant hegemonic narratives are often that we haven't done that, right? We haven't got that, rather than where are the resilience, where are the resistance happening. The personal experience going to the Philippines, kind of empire studies with several ecumenical churches, and I think Mayan and I actually wrote an article about that. And in there, what I learned is that in the Philippines, about 500 years of the colonization happened, right? Throughout centuries, from Spanish to the U.S. and so on. And yet, some of the leaders were telling us that there are parts of the Philippines that never colonized, that there are those indigenous people, small, not big, they lived and consistently resisted and maintained their way of life. And just noting that, I think, was such a redemptive and inspiring to witness, to hear and see and act. So, how do we connect? I think stories from Pastor Kim, underground seminary stories, so inspiring. There are places doing those kind of work, even if it's never perfect, never complete, but there are that kind of beacons of hopes and signs of resilience and resistance are happening. And I think we need to share and support and collectively growing that. Even though it will never be the same as what I'm doing here in Toronto or, Minnesota and so on. So the context and the situations and realities are not same at all. And yet we know that things are happening. So the, kind of hegemonic narrative of that we haven't got that, I want to switch, turn the side at what is actually happening. Despite that's never been a dominant. I mean, Jesus' story is never dominant, right? And prophets in the entire Hebrew Bible, none of the prophets are dominant discourse. It was that subversive, nonetheless constant resistance stories that we held on and passed down, right? Our ancestors did that. I think our job also to pass that down. And having those kind of glimpses of achievement and change is happening and that things got better and that, so on. So that I think that perspective, that way of looking at the issues and telling that issues in a way that is more connected, as Erica, you mentioned, connecting each other despite our differences.
That's a really beautiful reframe. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I wanted to lift up, we have a few more minutes left. If anybody has, great, Maravir wants to share. That note that you had about vulnerability and the importance of part of this is educating for vulnerability, and how I'm struck by how our current structures, again, kind of perpetuate this notion of the superhuman individualist, and that works antithetically to that notion of vulnerability and how important that is. So I'm struck by that. I'm going to invite Maravir on our stage. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Feel free to correct me.
Yes, it's correct. I could see myself though, but can you hear me? Oh, there I am. I'd like to thank Dr. Kim-Cragg for sharing about the Philippines, where I was born. And this is an affirmation of your observation that there are certain indigenous communities in the Philippines that have not really totally absorbed Catholicism, because, Catholicism is a colonial legacy. And there are also areas that have been Islamized in the southern part of the country that did not embrace Catholicism. And an interesting, curious way of seeing that is that we are able to speak our own indigenous language despite the Spanish way of teaching the Holy Mass. We were not allowed, the old people were not allowed to, read the Bible before. And then towards American colonialism, people were allowed to read the Bible in English. But we maintained our language. I maintained my Cebuano language. So I speak English, but when I go home, I speak our Cebuano language. So that is like, we are hanging on to that. We have that indigenous culture within us. And before colonialism, we were matrilineal as a society, as like very tribal matrilineal society where women were equal with men and had leadership roles and had agricultural roles and, priestesses as well. So embedded in our colonial psyche, the women are strong. It seems like we are submissive, but actually when you marry a Filipina, she becomes actually a very influential person in the family. So these are nitty-gritty and very interesting realities that have to be looked at academically, I hope, spiritually, and have to be shared. And I appreciate if we would have studies like that, specific also to women leadership in the church, because our leadership is very subconscious, very subtle. And I shout out to the women leaders here who speak well about leading on, like saving the society from our own messy ways. So thank you so much. And also shout out to Dr. Winings, who is my professor at UTS. Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There's lots of notes in the comments. I'd like to give you all one last opportunity to share any last thoughts that you might have. And if you want to address any comments, you can. But otherwise, any closing thoughts that you might have to share with us.
I'll just say, don't be afraid to dream dreams. Nothing happens if we don't imagine what's possible. Thank you for this opportunity.
And let's imagine together. Thank you.
I think we need to rehearse the reign of God as if it is here. And that rehearsal takes actors, takes stage, takes places, and have fun with it. We can't do it rehearsal alone, even if it's a monologue, right? We need still directors and designers and all kinds. So let's rehearse the Reign of God here and now.
I really don't have anything to add to that. I love the idea of rehearsing the Reign of God, and part of what I like about it is everyone does have a part to play, and it looks very different and very in different places. I think one of the problems we face is a sense of scarcity and competition, and I know where that comes from in our culture, but I think we are kidding ourselves if we think we're not immune. That's part of the practice, right? That's part of the Christian practice, is to resist those very, very deeply held beliefs that there's not enough, and so I better make sure I get mine. And I think, Erica asked how we support each other. I think it's working on letting go of that. That's an inside job.
And that scarcity mentality requires supremacy notions and capitalist notions, because it's what fuels it. So that is, and that idea of we all have a part to play changes our conception of what ministry can be, and helps us to read. So these are all, there's just so much there. I'm like, we could just take that last comment and keep going here, but we unfortunately are out of time. I want to please join me, those of you that are still here, please join me in giving one more big thank you and virtual applause to our three panelists. And again, you have the links there at the very, very first comment in the comment box. You'll find some links that will connect you to some of the work that our three panelists are doing or have done. I also want to remind you all that there's the session feedback button that should have popped up on your screen by now. So please don't forget to fill that out to give REA a little bit of feedback about what could be improved about sessions. And of course, we will receive that and be able to help. It will help us improve as well and offer webinars and programs that ALLLM likes to provide, which also in that link for our ALLLM, you'll find more recordings for past webinars that we've done, especially over the last year. The pandemic really allowed us an opportunity to produce a number of those. And so please check that out. There's some interesting resources, and we hope to stay connected with you all, whether through ALLLM or through REA or through just by connecting to us individually. We all hope to continue the conversation, and that's how these ideas continue to grow, and that's how we continue to begin to activate that imagination and to continue to dream, as Jin was reminding us to do. So thank you all again, and blessings on your day and the rest of your week and the rest of the conference.